Eugenics, quite simply, the origins of the words, it was a word coined first by Francis Galton in the late 1800s, and it quite literally translates to good genes. So whatever it is that we understand as good genes, which then was taken up in particular ways, it's not an inherently evil idea. And the goals of eugenics, of pretty much all eugenics, is the relief of suffering and the improvement of human beings. And so today those goals have found their way into medical genetics and mental health and illness that will often have those same goals of, you know, the relief from suffering and the improvement of human life. Now, the way that those concepts get interpreted, and sometimes people might take them to be like, might naturalize them. So you might look at it, well, isn't it natural to want to be free from suffering and to want to be better? But once we start to more critically look at, well, what does that actually mean? What does that translate to? What it translates to is up for human interpretation. And so the relief of suffering or the improvement of humans during World War II, I mean, that really got taken up in Europe in a way that sought to eradicate particular types of people. And again, racialized people, Jews, poor people that were thought of as feeble-minded. And feeble-minded perhaps is a good segue then into the mental hygiene movement, which, you know, eugenics often looked at the so-called health of the body, and mental hygiene looks at health of the mind. But again, with a similar kind of uncritical take, where some people's perspectives of what it means to have a healthy mind, and generally speaking, those perspectives are coming from a place of power and of privilege, came to really be put onto other people that were seen as inferior. And so many people, you know, during that time period of the Holocaust, many people were murdered. Not just Jews, but queers, you know, gypsies, like poor people. So there was an active attempt to weed out undesirable people, which is why ultimately that movement was condemned. But that part of eugenics is not inherent to it. So for example, in North America and in Canada, we had eugenics policies here right up until the mid-70s, which were sterilizing Aboriginal women and Indigenous women all throughout the country. Alberta especially had late eugenics policies. And even in Ontario, where that was abolished kind of earlier on, there's still a lot of talk from Indigenous communities that actually their women were sterilized far later than when the laws went away. So here too, there was an active attempt to weed out what was seen as undesirable and promote what was seen as desirable, but again, all from a position of privilege and power. So even after the eugenics movement in Canada, where the sterilization of Indigenous women continued, you know, I would argue that that is actually a direct extension of the eugenics movement, but a lot of those policies started to be funneled more through, rather than mental hygiene, through mental health, and through what was starting to form and become really solidified as psychiatry, which today holds a whole lot of power over what is normal, what is desirable, and conversely, what is not. And a lot of the concepts today of what is normal and what is desirable actually have a lot to do with working and socializing appropriately. So it kind of, it supports these ideals of what citizens need to be, what desirable citizens and what productive people. So it also ties into all these capitalist ideas where all of a sudden, if you can't or won't work in a way that is deemed normal within the society that you're living in, you know, pretty quickly you will probably find yourself given a diagnosis of a psychiatric disorder and labeled as mentally ill. I think the chemical imbalance hypothesis is one good example for that. Although it is becoming more and more discredited, that's kind of been the line for decades at this point, at least since the 1990s, where people who are diagnosed as mentally ill are thought to have a chemical imbalance, and that's been presented as, you know, the levels of neurotransmitters in the brain are imbalanced, they're off. So you should be producing more dopamine or serotonin, to take two examples of two neurotransmitters that are thought to be related to happiness. And so conversely, they are assumed to be related to depression. If a person is depressed, they are assumed to have lower levels of dopamine and of serotonin. And these are tests that are generally not performed. Like, people don't measure the levels of neurotransmitters in your brain before giving a diagnosis of depression. However, we do know that neurotransmitters work in a way that is not separate from the material outside world. So there is a connection between your body and the world around it. So things like sunshine, music, orgasm, sometimes even drugs, might be known to produce higher levels of dopamine, touch, hugs, you know, basic things, even during COVID, when, you know, you can't really hug anyone that's outside of your immediate bubble. And so people who are living alone have been noticing how difficult that is without human touch. And so these external material factors are known to influence the way that your body produces particular neurotransmitters, such as dopamine and serotonin. And I'm not a scientist, so I can only speak to this kind of on a basic level. But somehow, within psychiatric diagnoses, there is no room to consider context and the external environment and how a person might be interacting with the world when we think about the levels of dopamine that their brains might be producing. And so again, what begins to appear as mental illness, oftentimes, actually, you know, when you look at the social world around a person, might look like oppression and marginalization. Oftentimes it might look like poverty, it might look like discrimination in an ongoing kind of way. And there's nothing currently in our concepts of well-being and of mental health, at least not in the official psychiatric line of things, to consider the context of a person's life and how that might be interacting with their bodies. So even things like the social determinants of health, which you know, sometimes get brought up in these kinds of situations. You know, if somebody is in poverty, they might not be able to go see a dentist. They might not be able to, you know, take care of their bodies in all sorts of ways. They might be working, you know, 18-hour days and under a whole lot of stress, and, you know, with several jobs, and not really have a very supportive life built around them. And that will get diagnosed as though it's a purely physical chemical imbalance in their brain that's somehow disconnected from the life that they're living. And so again, similar to the eugenics era, we start to see how social problems and social issues and social inequalities come to be framed through a medical lens. And as soon as you get that diagnosis of, well, I have biological depression, suddenly everything that makes a person feel depressed, it loses its connectedness to the outside world. That maybe, you know, I'm living with ongoing domestic abuse, or like whatever a person's situation and stresses might be, all of a sudden that becomes removed. And it just seems like it's something wrong internally with your personal biology individually. So it kind of individualizes these issues as though they are individual issues. So it's actually, I think, kind of a direct line between eugenics and psychiatry today. but I also think on the other side of that, a lot of people really do find relief in that diagnosis that, okay, it's not me, you know, maybe I am crazy, but maybe I'm not crazy. There is something wrong. An expert knows about it and can try and fix it. So there is hope for the relief of that suffering. And I think that that's an important part to recognize as well, that it's not just this terrible kind of making a person feel responsible for their bad biology, but for a lot of people there is relief in that diagnosis. And sorry, there's a fly buzzing around me.